Can everyone see my presentation?
Yes.
Wonderful.
Yep.
So I'll introduce myself. My name is Drew Jamison. I am the Development Director for Urban Projects at the Suburban Land Agency. And we also have Jess Hillcrest here as well. Jess, you're the Program Manager for Built Form. Is that your title?
Housing Choice.
Housing Choices.
Program Manager, Housing Choice. Yeah.
And Mayumi is here as well. So today we'll be talking about Turner Section 57, which, as Jakob mentioned, is on Northbourne Avenue. It's next to Hague Park. I'll give a very quick overview about the Suburban Land Agency and our role with land development before we get into the site. So we perform underneath the City Renewal Authority and Suburban Land Agency Act of 2017. We have a statement of intent and we perform in line with our minister, who is Minister Yvette Berry's expectations. And we do this via the Indicative Land Release Program, which comes out every year, that identifies blocks to be released within the forward 4 years. We also do this in line with other ACT government policies and objectives, and we undertake a variety of different engagement methodologies depending on the project complexity. Our key objective is to create great places where communities thrive, and this is not just in our greenfield sites, it's also within our urban infill sites, and it's something that we are quite keen to make sure is covered across every precinct that we look at. Looking at how we fit in with the ACT government, this is something that we want to make sure is quite clear. Sites are identified by EPSDD, which is Environment Planning and Sustainable Development Directorate. They're the planning authority in this case, and they identify a site, they undertake the planning for that, and they undertake a business case. Once that is identified and the project is handed across to the Suburban Land Agency, we are then the delivery agency for that site. And we will take care of that site and we will do further due diligence and get that site ready to be released. Following our release to market, and it is purchased by a company, then they will undertake their own built form design and then go back to EPSDD with their development application and building approvals. So tonight we're going to be talking specifically about Section 57, which is on Northbourne Avenue, this site here, specifically Block 3 and Block 4 of Section 57, which is bordered by Northbourne Avenue, Greenway Street, Forbes Street, and Condamine Street. And this site is to be subdivided into 2 blocks with 2 distinct purposes. The northern block, Block 3, has been identified as a build-to-rent site as a bit of a project pilot for the ACT government, and it is identified to be released next financial year, in financial year 22-23. The build-to-rent is subject to ACT government decisions, but indicatively that's what the site is identified for, with approximately 270 dwellings, a mix of communal spaces for residents and potential for ground floor retail commercial uses, given its proximity to the light rail stop. The southern 2/3 of the block are identified within the Indicative Land Release Program for release within this current financial year, and it's going to achieve approximately 470 dwellings. This is the indicative site subdivision, so you can see our intents for the site. The build to rent in the north and the indicative land release program in the south. When we presented, I believe in October of last year, we had identified that the subdivision process we were going to take was going to be a state development plan, an EDP process. That's a process that is quite complicated, and it's normally undertaken when there are quite significant either unknowns or challenges or assets to be handed back to the territory. So if you're trying to subdivide, build a new road and hand the road back to the territory, you would undertake an EDP. When we started this process, there were a few unknowns for the site, which I'll talk about in the next slide, which is specifically around built form. There was a draft variation in place that, as well, I'll talk in a moment, has been in place for quite a while. So as we undertook the process and we learned more about the project, we came to the conclusion that we didn't need to go through the more complicated EDP process, that as the project resolved itself, a simple, straightforward subdivision process would achieve the results and the outcomes that we needed. One of the key things is we need to ensure that stormwater is serviced and that can be captured. So that brings us to the development outcomes for this site. Many of you may know about DB 368, which is the City and Gateway Urban Design Framework that's been in draft for quite a while. When we started the process, it was still an ongoing draft variation, and we were unaware of what the timing for that draft variation, when was that going to be adopted. So when we started the process, we thought the best way that we could achieve development outcomes was through the EDP process by locking some things in through planning control plans. But since that process, it has become more clearer that DB 368 is now imminent. It is not going to inquiry, which is, we were anticipating a 12-month review process. So that process is not going ahead, and it is to be tabled in the Legislative Assembly next month, which is actually quite a good thing for us, because we can achieve a far higher outcome, far higher quality outcome for the site through DB 368, through the City and the Gateway Urban Design Framework, because it controls building separation, building heights, solar access, which is quite a critical one for ensuring a very high quality internal amenity to these apartments, because you have to achieve 70% of all apartments must achieve a minimum of 3 hours of solar access in the winter solstice. So that really dictates how the built form can work. How do you get appropriate building separation to achieve that solar access when you're talking about 8-story buildings? It also dictates cross ventilation to make sure that, as we are very conscious about the sustainability measures on the site, cross ventilation in our very hot climate during summer is quite a critical key to achieving a more sustainable site. So in anticipation of this being adopted next month, we have undertaken a very high level, and this is only indicative only, this concept study, to understand what the built form outcome could be achieved on this site using the DB 368 policies. And so this is just an indicative thing to identify how we would subdivide our site into the 2 releases. So indicatively here, we've got North 1 Avenue down the side. The build to rent site is the one up the front. The indicative land release site is the further 2/3 down there, and then Hay Park in the background. So as previously identified, the build to rent site will be released next financial year. The indicative land release site will be released this year, with the developer undertaking their works, whoever chooses to buy the site, undertaking their works next financial year, with further opportunities for community consultation in their DA process. What I'll do now is I'll pass along to Jess to talk a bit further in the build to rent and what does that mean for this site and more in general.
Thanks, Drew. So did give a brief update on build to rent and the concept at I think in October, but just to reiterate that when we're talking about build to rent, we're talking about a model of single ownership. So the building is retained by usually an institutional investor or some kind of build to rent operator who, rather than selling out the individual dwellings, will offer them for long-term secure rental. And so we've been exploring this as a potential mechanism for increasing rental supply in Canberra, increasing the amount of affordable rental options that we have available, providing a bit more security of tenure and a bit more choice for renters, and also looking at, I guess, creating a better sense of community and a more livable community where people who are renting have that ability to have a bit more of to personalize their spaces a little bit more and have a bit more of a sense of ownership of their homes as they rent them for a longer period of time. So back in October, we flagged that we were going to be running a market sounding process to gather feedback from industry and the community housing sector about their thoughts about build to rent, their thoughts about the potential of the site in Turner, and to get that feedback together so that we could inform government decisions about potentially running a pilot project for build to rent. So Drew, you could probably jump to the next slide. But we ran that market sounding process. So it was open from the 10th of November to the 10th of December. And we got a good range of responses. We got more than 20 submissions from some different developers, operators, some peak organisations and advocacy groups, some community housing providers, a couple of individuals, and also some institutional investors. So we were quite pleased with the type of respondents that we received. We have pulled together a listening report outlining all of the feedback that we got through the process. So outlining some of the feedback about dwelling mix and the sorts of potential yields, some of the preferences about operating models, that sort of thing. So we've outlined all of that in a listening report, and we're just preparing to publish that on our website in the next couple of weeks. So probably the first week in May, that'll be up on our website. And we will definitely let you know once that's up there so that you can have a look. In terms of the Turner site, we did ask a couple of questions specifically about that to sort of gather feedback about whether it was an appropriate site for build to rent from the perspective of the developers and operators and people who are already very familiar with running build to rent projects in other jurisdictions. And generally the feedback was yes, that it is a great site for that because of its proximity to the city, its proximity to the light rail. It was generally, you know, the size and sort of dwelling yields that we've been talking about is would meet those requirements. And so that was really good feedback for us. So what we're in the process of doing now is we're feeding all of that information into government, into some decision-making processes that are happening at the moment. So probably I would suggest keep an eye out for potential budget announcements and also some further decisions about potential support for build to rent. And then we'll be coming back to do some further discussions as we get closer to potentially releasing the site in Turner for build to rent, likely later this calendar year. And so we'll come back to have a further more detailed discussion with the North Canberra Community Council as we get closer to that time frame. And once we have some confirmation about some government decisions for that. So that's build to rent in a nutshell. Did you have anything else to add, Drew, or otherwise? I think we open up for discussion. Hopefully we kept to time efficiently.
Thanks heaps, Jessica and Drew. Can you stop sharing? Then we can have a better discussion. Thanks. Any comments?
Can I ask a technical question? The Suburban Land Agency is doing this, but what about the City Renewal Agency or Authority? Isn't this their area?
That's correct. The City Renewal Authority is responsible for the Northbound Corridor, but we are undertaking this development on their behalf. I believe it's due to resourcing schedules, but we work very closely with our colleagues over at the City Renewal Authority to work on this project.
Margaret. Henderson, you need to.
Thanks.
Unmute.
Yes, I'm unmuted. One thing that's been curious for me about build to rent is what are the sort of governing rules? Will those buildings be subject to strata law, or will there be some sort of separate regime in the ACT to set out the rules for build to rent? I'm thinking of the tenants. One of the things I'm concerned about is what's to stop a developer selling up when market conditions are favourable to them and voiding everybody's tenancies.
Yes, no, that's definitely a area of concern, and definitely that came through as part of the feedback in the market sounding process. It was some specific feedback about the ACT's residential tenancy laws. So we are currently looking at what the options are for us to require site to be retained as a tenant over a longer term period of time in order to prevent exactly that selling down aspect.
Jessica, your line is very jumpy.
Yeah, likewise for me as well.
Clear answer on exactly what that mechanism will be, but we're currently looking into that, and that will be part of what we need to resolve prior to releasing a site. Can everybody hear me?
Maybe if you turn off your video, that might reduce the lag, because it's just lagging a bit too much for us to hear. Sorry.
But I think we understood what you were saying. I have a more fundamental question.
Yes, can you hear me now?
Yeah. I think we understood what you were saying.
Yes, so just in a nutshell, we're investigating mechanisms to ensure that that does not happen.
Okay.
Thanks very much. Thank you.
I have a couple of other questions. One is I may have missed it in Drew's slides, but there are many projects along Northbourne Avenue. So who decides that you should get involved in a project?
In terms of how it gets released, or?
Well, and the design and things like approaching something like social housing or affordable housing and whatever. Who decided that this particular block should be under your auspices?
So that direction comes from Environment Planning and Sustainable Development Directorate, EPSDD. So they identify the individual blocks to be released, whether it's on Northbourne Avenue or anywhere else within the territory. And they also identify what is to go on that site, whether it's residential or commercial or community uses. And they'll identify the level of dwellings, the quantity of dwellings. They'll also identify the quantity of any affordable housing, public housing, or community housing. And so that all gets identified within the indicative land release program, what I was mentioning at the beginning. So the indicative land release program gets released every budget, roughly every budget. I think it's coming out later in the year. And it identifies the developments, the sites to be released within the 4 years going forward. So once that site is identified, then the SLA gets involved.
See, it's unusual that we are being consulted so early on in a development. So I'm interested in who decides that you should talk to us about a development like this. Because there are lots of developments along Northbourne Avenue, which the developers in the end asked us what we thought about it, and then mostly ignored what we were saying. So my question is, what is happening here? So I'm confused.
Well, we feel that consultation is very valuable input into our developments. So for us, it's quite a critical component of how we run our developments. The challenge is once it gets handed over to a developer, we certainly encourage them on some of our sites, we mandate that they must continue the consultation through with the community. But we often just require them to consult.
True.
How they?
I'm not quite sure. Maybe I wasn't quite clear.
Yeah.
Why is not every development along Northbourne Avenue under your control?
Certainly any sites that are under the Suburban Land Agency's control, we will definitely consult with the community.
No, but why is not every development along Northbourne Avenue, under your control?
Oh, why aren't, well, it's, yeah, so the City Renewal Authority has that control over Northbourne Avenue's corridor. So this site is, I guess, a special candidate because we have just taken this particular site over individually. But in terms of why we're not in control of all of the sites along Northbourne Avenue, I'm not entirely sure why. I would like to have more control myself, but that's me speaking personally.
Lachlan, I might have an answer for you there. I think, as far as I understand, the Suburban Land Agency was involved in some of the other blocks until they were released and until a developer purchased them, and then it gets handed over into the planning process, and then the work of the Suburban Land Agency is done. That's correct. My understanding.
Yes.
Also, I might just jump. Sorry. Sorry, I might just jump in there and just also add that some of the sites along Northbourne Avenue that were released much earlier, either by the former Land Development Agency or in the early days of the Suburban Land Agency, may not have had the same level of engagement as per our current approach. We currently are taking a much more involved approach with engagement. Also, we are only involved in sites that are government owned, like territory land that is being released, not sites that are already in the hands of private developers.
Jess, can I ask you a question while you're there? I was interested, you were saying about looking at build to rent because of the lack of available long-term secure rentals. Have you considered at all what's happened in Hobart, whereby Airbnb is now banned by Hobart City Council so that there is more long-term accommodation available for people who live in Hobart?
That's not something that the Suburban Land Agency has been looking at because it's not relating necessarily to land release, but I am aware that some of our policy colleagues in other parts of the ACT government are looking at options in relation to that. Exactly what the status of that is, I can't give you an update, but I am aware that there have been some discussions happening. I could take on notice to see if I can get any more information about that for you from another part of the ACT Gov.
That would be great if you're able to. It just seems to me like a fairly straightforward solution to the lack of long-term rental that's available in Canberra.
Yeah, I'll see what I can find out for you.
Thank you, I appreciate that.
And I also presume for governments to introduce a tax for any properties that are purposely held empty, especially apartments.
Can I just ask something about build to rent? You might have mentioned it and I missed it, but while I understand the security of tenure, I'm just wondering, will the rents in those buildings be cheaper than the market rent? So, I mean, is there some sort of guarantee that there will be, affordable rental properties in that building, or will there be a requirement for some proportion of social housing or community housing in those buildings?
In terms of the whole building, the rental will likely be a majority market rent, but we are going to be requiring a proportion to be affordable rentals. So it won't be public housing. And we are just currently determining whether we would require a community housing provider to operate that or whether some other kind of affordable rental arrangement. But yes, we are looking at a proportion being fixed for affordable rental.
So what sort of proportion are we talking about?
That's one of the things that's currently subject to some government decision making. So we got a range of feedback through the market sounding process, and we're just waiting now to get some decision on exactly what proportion we land with. It's likely to be around at least sort of in that 15% range, but waiting on some decisions to confirm that.
Just to flag something we flagged when we talked first last year, there has been a lot of social housing along Northbourne Avenue, which is now used for other purposes. And from our perspective, what you're doing is all commendable, but it doesn't make up for the loss of social housing along Northbourne Avenue and along the public transport corridor.
So it's a case of what all the stuff that all the buildings that were knocked down, as far as I'm aware, they were all some sort of social housing. So at least that, if not that plus a bit more, should be replaced.
Yes, and not somewhere out in the paddock. Any other questions?
Just to clarify, though, the 15% isn't social housing; it's affordable housing.
Yeah.
Which is, I mean, and how is affordable housing sort of defined, or how have you sort of formulated what would constitute affordable rent in this circumstance?
Yeah, so probably two things just to add there. One is in terms of the public housing, that's probably a discussion to have with Housing ACT in terms of their preferences for the location of public housing. So that's just one thing. In terms of the affordable rental, the current sort of discussions are about 74.9% of market rent, which is what the community housing providers use as their definition under the national regulatory system. The other thing that we'll be looking at is eligibility criteria for people to be able to participate in the affordable rental.
Can I also, we just got a question put in through the chat. I can respond to that now if we want. It's about traffic volumes, about the quantity of traffic generated by 740 dwellings on the site. The traffic report's not required until today. So we have already undertaken our traffic impact assessment at this stage, and that forms part of our sales documents. It's actually based on a higher traffic volume to make sure that we capture a worst case scenario. And in our discussions with TCCS, the traffic authority, we have come to an agreement on how the site will impact its all the surrounding streets or not impact quite significantly. So we have worked with them as well on where driveway locations should be on Forbes Street and on Greenway Street, with egress only for waste vehicles and for emergency vehicles onto Northbourne Avenue in order to alleviate stress on the surrounding streets. So it is actually quite a key consideration for us, traffic impacts on the surrounding road network, which is why we have already undertaken the impact assessment, and it will be part of the sales documents when the site goes to be released.
Can I ask a question? I'm very interested in knowing, Drew and Jessica, to what level of current but also projected standards in terms of the building code. I understand that there's some kind of real insight now into proper environmental concerns in relation to building codes, including ventilation, double glazing, possibly triple glazing. You mentioned solar access, etc. And I think that, from my understanding, that there's some kind of revision happening. To what level of building code, if that's the right terminology, are you going to, or you planning to actually construct these buildings?
We won't be undertaking the construction or the design of the buildings themselves. That will be whoever chooses to buy the site later in the release. So it will have to comply with all of the territory guidelines as well as the National Construction Code, the NCC. So it will need to comply with all of those. I don't believe we'll be mandating anything much higher than that, so 7-star, Green Star, or things like that on this site.
For the build to rent portion, we are looking at potentially requiring higher sustainability standards, like something like Green Star. We haven't landed yet on the exact specification, but in the market sounding, we'd ask for feedback on that if we were to require higher standards, and it came back quite positive. That would be looked on favourably. So we are looking to put something in place to prevent, noting that that's important for reducing running costs for tenants.
Thanks, Jessica.